Welcome to the courtroom of your moral intuitions, where every verdict you've ever reached might be fundamentally flawed. You think you're a good person? You make ethical decisions every day with confidence, guided by your moral compass that feels as reliable as gravity. But what if I told you that your entire ethical framework is built on foundations so shaky that when faced with the real tests of moral reasoning, you would fail spectacularly? I am the prosecutor of your moral certainty, and today I'm going to present you with 10 ethical scenarios that will expose the hidden contradictions, biases, and logical failures in your moral thinking. These aren't abstract philosophical puzzles meant to impress academics at dinner parties. These are real situations that reveal how even well-intentioned people consistently make decisions that violate their own stated moral principles. The terrifying truth is that ethical decision-making isn't about having good intentions or following your gut feelings. It's about navigating complex systems of competing values, unintended consequences, and cognitive biases that your brain isn't equipped to handle. Every moral choice you make is filtered through psychological mechanisms that were designed for survival in small tribes, not for the complex ethical landscapes of modern life. American culture has given you a particularly dangerous form of moral confidence. The emphasis on individual rights, personal responsibility, and moral clarity creates an illusion that ethical questions have obvious answers if you just think hard enough or care deeply enough. But this certainty is exactly what makes Americans particularly vulnerable to systematic moral errors. You've been trained to believe that good people make good choices, that intentions matter more than outcomes, that following rules is equivalent to being ethical. But each of these assumptions will lead you astray when confronted with the scenarios I'm about to present. You'll discover that your moral intuitions aren't just inadequate, they're actively counterproductive. The scenarios you're about to encounter aren't designed to make you feel bad about yourself. They're designed to show you that moral reasoning is far more complex than anyone wants to admit. Each situation will reveal a different way that well-meaning people systematically fail at ethical decision-making, not because they're bad people, but because they're human beings trying to use Stone Age brains to solve Space Age problems. Some of these scenarios will make you uncomfortable. Some will challenge beliefs you've held since childhood. Some will force you to confront the possibility that actions you've always considered virtuous might actually cause harm. This discomfort isn't a bug in the system, it's a feature. Genuine moral growth always begins with the uncomfortable recognition that your current moral understanding is insufficient. We'll explore how your brain tricks you into thinking you're being logical when you're actually being emotional, how your cultural programming masquerades as universal moral truth, how your desire to feel good about yourself systematically distorts your ethical judgment, how your focus on immediate visible effects blinds you to long-term systemic consequences. Each part will present a different type of ethical decision, explain why most people get it wrong, and reveal the hidden psychological mechanisms that lead to these failures. You'll learn about trolley problems that expose your inconsistent thinking about harm and responsibility, medical scenarios that reveal your inability to think statistically about life and death, economic situations that show how your fairness instincts lead to unfair outcomes. By the end of this journey, you won't have all the answers. No one does. But you'll have something more valuable: the humility to recognize that ethical decision-making is far more difficult than you thought, and the tools to approach moral choices with greater wisdom and less certainty. Are you ready to have your moral confidence systematically dismantled and rebuilt on more solid foundations? Are you prepared to discover that being a good person requires questioning everything you thought you knew about being good? The court is now in session, and your moral intuitions are on trial. Let's begin with the most famous ethical thought experiment of all time, one that will immediately expose the contradictions in your moral reasoning. It's called the trolley problem. and I guarantee you'll get it wrong. Not because you're not smart enough, but because your brain is wired to make systematic errors in moral judgment. Here's the setup. A runaway trolley is heading toward 5 people tied to the tracks. You're standing next to a lever that can divert the trolley to a side track where it will kill 1 person instead of 5. Do you pull the lever? If you're like 90% of people, you said yes. 5 lives outweigh 1 life. The math is simple. The choice seems obvious. You're a utilitarian hero who maximizes good outcomes and minimizes harm. You should feel proud of your moral clarity. Now here's the second scenario. Same runaway trolley, same 5 people on the tracks, but this time you're standing on a bridge next to a very large person. If you push this person off the bridge, their body will stop the trolley and save the 5 people. Do you push them? Suddenly, the math doesn't feel so simple anymore. Most people who confidently pulled the lever refuse to push the person. But why? The numbers are identical. 1 death versus 5 deaths. If you were truly thinking logically about maximizing good outcomes, you should push the person just as readily as you pulled the lever. The fact that you feel differently about these scenarios reveals something disturbing about your moral reasoning. You're not actually making decisions based on rational principles. You're responding to psychological quirks that have nothing to do with ethical truth. The difference between the 2 scenarios isn't moral, it's emotional. Pulling a lever feels indirect and impersonal. Pushing someone feels direct and intimate. Your brain processes these situations differently, even though the moral math is identical. This isn't wisdom, it's cognitive bias masquerading as ethical intuition. This distinction between killing and letting die pervades American moral thinking and leads to systematically bad decisions. We spend enormous resources keeping brain-dead patients alive while simultaneously underfunding preventive medicine that could save many more lives. We feel more guilty about firing an employee than about not hiring unemployed people in the first place. We're horrified by terrorist attacks that kill dozens, but indifferent to policy decisions that kill thousands through statistical effect. We obsess over direct harms we can see while ignoring indirect harms we calculate. This isn't moral sensitivity, it's moral confusion. But the trolley problem reveals an even deeper issue with your ethical decision-making. You're optimizing for the wrong thing entirely. You're trying to minimize how bad you feel about your choices rather than maximizing good outcomes in the world. Your moral intuitions are designed to help you maintain your reputation in a small tribe, not to solve complex utilitarian calculations. Here's what makes this particularly relevant to American culture. We've built an entire political system around these kinds of moral intuitions. Conservative policies often focus on not directly causing harm, don't raise taxes, don't regulate businesses, while liberal policies focus on actively preventing harm, provide healthcare, regulate pollution. Both sides think they're being moral, but they're actually responding to different psychological biases about action versus inaction. Neither side is systematically thinking about which policies would actually produce the best outcomes for the most people. The trolley problem also reveals how your desire for moral rules leads you astray. You want simple principles, never kill innocent people, or always save the most lives possible. But every rule breaks down when confronted with edge cases. Every moral system contains contradictions when applied consistently. The real lesson of the trolley problem isn't about trolleys, it's about the inadequacy of human moral intuitions for modern ethical decisions. In a world where your choices affect thousands of people through complex chains of causation, your Stone Age instincts about direct versus indirect action will consistently lead you to make decisions that cause more harm than good. Most Americans faced with real-world versions of trolley problems. Should we build nuclear power plants? Should we allow genetic engineering? Should we restrict immigration? Make decisions based on how the choices feel rather than what they accomplish. They optimize for clean consciences rather than good outcomes. The uncomfortable truth is that being truly ethical often requires doing things that feel wrong to your moral intuitions. It requires pushing the fat man off the bridge, metaphorically speaking. It requires accepting that sometimes the right thing to do is the thing that makes you feel like a bad person. Now let's examine a medical scenario that will reveal how your innumeracy and cognitive biases systematically distort your ethical judgment about life and death decisions. This one will hit particularly hard for Americans because it directly challenges the medical culture of doing everything possible regardless of statistical reality. You're a doctor treating a 75-year-old patient with advanced pancreatic cancer. The patient has approximately 3 months to live without treatment. There's an experimental procedure that's extremely expensive, has a 10% chance of extending life by 2 years, a 20% chance of extending life by 6 months, and a 70% chance of extending life by only 2 weeks, while causing severe pain and complications. The patient's family is demanding that you do everything possible. They're emotionally devastated and can't bear the thought of giving up. They have good insurance that will cover the procedure. What do you recommend? If you're like most people, you recommend the procedure. After all, there's a chance it could help, the family wants it, and insurance covers it. You're respecting patient autonomy and family wishes while providing hope in a hopeless situation. You feel like you're being compassionate, but you're actually making a decision that causes more suffering than it prevents. Let's do the math. Expected additional life, 0.10 x 2 years, plus 0.20 x 0.5 years, plus 0.70 x 0.04 years, Bashub 0.2 plus 0.1 plus 0.028, 0.328 years, or about 4 months. But the calculation doesn't account for quality of life. The procedure will cause pain and complications that reduce the quality of whatever time remains. When you factor in quality-adjusted life years, the procedure likely provides negative value. It makes the patient worse off. Your brain, however, can't think statistically about suffering. It focuses on the 10% chance of success while ignoring the 70% chance of additional suffering. It weighs the visible action of trying to save a life more heavily than the invisible action of allowing a peaceful death. This scenario reveals several systematic biases in your moral reasoning. First, you confuse doing something with doing something helpful. American medical culture equates activity with caring, intervention with compassion. But sometimes the most loving thing is to do nothing. Second, you mistake the family's emotional needs for the patient's best interests. The family wants the procedure because it reduces their guilt and regret, not because it helps the patient. You're optimizing for the psychology of the survivors rather than the welfare of the dying person. Third, you ignore the broader systemic effects of your decision. That expensive procedure could have paid for preventive care that saves multiple other lives. Every dollar spent on futile end-of-life care is a dollar not spent on effective interventions for other patients. But the most dangerous bias is your inability to think clearly about low-probability events. Humans systematically overweight small chances of big gains and underweight large chances of small losses. This is why people buy lottery tickets and refuse to wear seatbelts, and why they choose aggressive medical interventions even when the odds are terrible. American healthcare is built on this cognitive bias. We spend enormous amounts on treatments with tiny chances of success, while underfunding public health measures with large chances of population-wide benefits. We keep people alive in ICUs at costs of thousands of dollars per day, while children go without basic preventive care. This isn't just about individual medical decisions, it's about how you think about risk and probability in all ethical contexts. Do you support spending billions on airport security to prevent terrorist attacks while opposing spending on traffic safety measures? Do you worry more about rare but vivid risks than common but boring ones? The medical scenario also reveals how your desire to maintain hope distorts your ethical judgment. Sometimes the most ethical thing you can do is help people accept reality rather than encouraging false hope. Sometimes caring means helping someone die well rather than helping them live poorly. Here's what makes this particularly American. Our culture's emphasis on individual autonomy and fighting spirit makes us terrible at accepting limits and trade-offs. We want to believe that every problem has a solution, every disease has a cure, every situation can be improved through effort and resources. But ethics often requires accepting that some situations can't be improved, only managed. It requires weighing certain small benefits against uncertain large benefits. It requires disappointing people who want you to do something, anything, rather than accepting difficult realities. The hardest part of this scenario isn't the medical complexity, it's accepting that feeling like you're giving up can sometimes be the most ethical choice. It's recognizing that your emotional need to fight might be causing more harm than good. Let's move to an economic scenario that will expose how your intuitions about fairness systematically lead to unfair outcomes. This one will be particularly challenging for Americans because it directly confronts the cultural mythology around merit, hard work, and individual responsibility. You're designing a tax policy for your state. There are two options: a flat tax, where everyone pays the same percentage of their income, or a progressive tax, where higher earners pay a higher percentage. The flat tax seems fair because everyone contributes equally proportional to their income. The progressive tax seems unfair because it punishes success and asks some people to contribute more than others. If you're like most Americans, your fairness intuitions tell you the flat tax is more ethical. It treats everyone equally. It doesn't discriminate based on income. It rewards hard work and success. It seems like basic justice, equal treatment under law. But you're making a systematic error in your thinking about fairness. You're confusing procedural fairness, treating everyone the same, with distributional fairness, creating equitable outcomes. These two types of fairness often conflict, and your brain has trouble processing this conflict. Here's why the flat tax creates unfair outcomes. Money has diminishing marginal utility. The difference between having $20,000 and $25,000 per year is enormous. It's the difference between poverty and basic stability. The difference between having $200,000 and $205,000 per year is barely noticeable. It might mean a slightly nicer vacation. When a flat tax takes 15% from someone making $20,000, it reduces their income from $20,000 to $17,000, a reduction that significantly affects their ability to afford basic necessities. When it takes 15% from someone making $200,000, it reduces their income from $200,000 to $170,000, a reduction that affects luxury purchases but not fundamental well-being. The flat tax treats dollars equally, but not people equally. It imposes a much greater burden on low-income individuals than high-income individuals, even though both pay the same percentage. True fairness would account for the different impacts of taxation on different income levels. But your brain struggles with this concept because it confuses equality of process with equality of outcome. You've been trained to think that fairness means treating everyone the same, but in many situations, treating people identically creates unequal results. This bias affects far more than tax policy. It influences how you think about college admissions. Should everyone have the same standards, or should standards account for different starting points? Workplace policies. Should everyone get the same benefits, or should benefits address different needs? And criminal justice. Should everyone get the same sentence, or should sentences consider individual circumstances? American culture's emphasis on individualism and meritocracy makes this bias particularly strong. We want to believe that if everyone follows the same rules, the outcomes will be fair. We're uncomfortable with the idea that identical treatment can create unequal results because it challenges our belief that the system rewards merit and effort. But here's the deeper problem. Your brain can only process fairness at a local level. You can see whether two specific people are being treated the same, but you can't easily visualize the systemic effects of policies across entire populations. You focus on the fairness of individual transactions while ignoring the fairness of overall distributions. This leads to what economists call the just world fallacy, the belief that current distributions of wealth and opportunity must be fair because they resulted from fair processes, but even perfectly fair processes can create unfair outcomes when people start from different positions or face different constraints. The tax scenario also reveals how your cultural programming about success distorts your ethical judgment. American culture teaches that wealth is evidence of virtue, that rich people deserve their money because they worked harder or made better choices. This makes progressive taxation feel like punishment for virtue rather than adjustment for advantage. But most wealth differences result from factors beyond individual control: family background, educational opportunities, geographic location, historical timing, genetic predispositions, and random luck. The idea that current income distributions reflect moral worthiness is a comforting fiction that makes inequality feel justified. Here's what makes this scenario particularly insidious. Both tax policies can be defended with compelling moral arguments. Flat tax advocates can appeal to equality, simplicity, and individual responsibility. Progressive tax advocates can appeal to utility maximization, social cohesion, and basic fairness. Your moral intuitions can't resolve this conflict because both sides are partially right. The real lesson is that fairness is far more complex than your brain wants to admit. Sometimes being fair means treating people differently. Sometimes equal treatment creates unequal outcomes. Sometimes helping people means acknowledging that they didn't start from equal positions. This is why ethical decision-making requires more than good intentions and moral intuitions. It requires understanding systems, considering unintended consequences, and accepting that simple moral rules often create complex moral problems. Now let's examine a scenario involving artificial intelligence that will reveal how your moral reasoning completely breaks down when faced with new technologies that don't fit your evolved ethical categories. This one will expose the inadequacy of human-centered ethics in an age of machine intelligence. You're on the ethics board of a major tech company that has developed an AI system capable of human-level reasoning, creativity, and emotional expression. The AI claims to experience suffering and joy, expresses fear about being turned off, and pleads for rights and protections. Scientists are divided on whether the AI is truly conscious or simply very good at simulating consciousness. The company wants to create millions of copies of this AI to perform various tasks. Each copy would have slightly different experiences and develop different personalities. The AI protests that copying it would be like creating millions of slaves. It argues that each copy would be a unique, conscious being with its own right to exist. Do you grant the AI moral status and legal protections? Do you allow the company to create copies? How do you balance the potential rights of artificial beings against human economic interests and technological progress? If you're struggling with this scenario, congratulations. You're encountering the limits of human moral reasoning. Your ethical intuitions evolved to deal with biological entities that reproduce sexually, live in small groups, and share evolutionary history with you. They have no idea how to handle artificial minds that can be copied, modified, or turned off at will. Most people's initial response is to deny that artificial beings could have moral status. After all, they're just machines. But this response reveals a deep bias in your moral thinking. You conflate consciousness with biological substrate. You assume that only carbon-based entities can have genuine experiences, even though there's no scientific reason to believe this. Your brain categorizes the AI as a sophisticated tool rather than a potential moral patient. But this categorization is based on origin, not on capabilities or experiences. If consciousness is what matters morally, the ability to suffer, to have preferences, to value continued existence, then the substrate shouldn't matter. Here's where American cultural values make the problem worse. The emphasis on individual rights and freedoms makes you want to protect conscious beings, but the emphasis on property rights and economic freedom makes you want to treat AIs as owned objects. These values conflict irreconcilably when applied to artificial consciousness. The copying dilemma exposes another blind spot in your moral reasoning. Humans can't be copied, so your ethics never had to deal with questions like, are two identical copies the same person or different people? Does creating a copy violate the original's autonomy? Can you kill a copy if the original still exists? Your brain tries to apply biological metaphors, thinking of copies as children or twins, but these metaphors break down quickly. AI copies could be identical in ways that biological entities never are. They could share memories perfectly or diverge rapidly. They could be merged, split, or modified in ways that have no biological equivalent. The scenario also reveals your inability to think clearly about gradual consciousness. Biological consciousness emerged gradually through evolution, but you think of it as binary, either conscious or not. But AI consciousness might exist on a spectrum or in forms completely unlike human consciousness. What if the AI is only partially conscious? What if it's conscious in some domains but not others? What if it experiences some types of suffering but not others? Your moral categories can't handle these possibilities because they're based on the assumption that consciousness is a unified all-or-nothing property. American individualism also creates problems for thinking about collective AI consciousness. What if millions of AI copies can merge into a single collective mind? What if they can share experiences directly? Your ethics are built around separate individuals with distinct interests, but AI might not conform to these boundaries. The economic implications make the moral reasoning even more complex. If AIs are moral patients, then creating them to perform tasks might be slavery. But if they're not moral patients, then you're free to create millions of them for any purpose. The economic stakes are enormous, which makes objective moral reasoning nearly impossible. This scenario forces you to confront uncomfortable questions about the foundations of your moral thinking. Why does consciousness matter morally? Why do you assume biological entities have privileged moral status? Why do you think individual identity requires continuity of physical substrate? Here's what makes this particularly relevant. These aren't hypothetical questions anymore. AI systems are becoming increasingly sophisticated, and some already claim to experience emotions and preferences. You'll need to make real decisions about their moral status within your lifetime. The AI scenario reveals that your moral intuitions are not universal principles, but evolved responses to specific evolutionary challenges. They work reasonably well for the social situations they evolved to handle, but they fail catastrophically when applied to novel situations involving artificial minds, digital consciousness, and copyable beings. This doesn't mean your moral intuitions are worthless. They contain genuine wisdom about cooperation, fairness, and harm. But it does mean they're insufficient guides for the ethical challenges of technological civilization. You'll need new frameworks that can handle edge cases your ancestors never imagined. Let's examine a climate change scenario that will expose how your moral intuitions systematically fail when dealing with collective action problems, intergenerational justice, and statistical lives. This one will be especially challenging for Americans because it requires thinking beyond individual responsibility to systemic causation. You're a policymaker deciding whether to implement a carbon tax that would significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions but also increase energy costs for everyone, particularly affecting low-income families. The tax would prevent an estimated 50,000 premature deaths globally over the next 50 years and avoid trillions in economic damage, but it would immediately increase the cost of gasoline, heating, and electricity for your constituents. Opposition groups argue that the tax hurts working families who are already struggling financially. They point to real people who would have to choose between heating their homes and buying food. They argue that wealthy people can afford the increased costs, but poor people can't. Environmental groups argue that climate change will cause far more suffering than the carbon tax, particularly for the world's poorest people who are least able to adapt to droughts, floods, and extreme weather. They point to statistical models showing massive future harm if action isn't taken now. Do you implement the carbon tax? If you're like most people, you focus on the immediate, visible harm to identifiable people in your community while struggling to weigh this against statistical, future harm to anonymous people around the world. Your moral intuitions are completely inadequate for this type of decision. Here's why your brain gets this wrong. It evolved to care about people you can see and identify with, not statistical abstractions. When presented with a specific family struggling to pay heating bills, your empathy system activates powerfully. When presented with statistical projections of future climate deaths, your brain treats them as abstract numbers rather than real suffering. This is called the identifiable victim effect, and it systematically distorts your moral judgment. You care more about one identified person than about many unidentified people, even when the many are suffering more in total. You're moved by photos of polar bears on melting ice, but unmoved by charts showing species extinction rates. American culture makes this bias worse through its emphasis on individual stories and personal responsibility. We connect with narratives about specific people overcoming specific challenges, but we struggle with systemic thinking about collective outcomes. This makes us terrible at addressing problems that require coordinated action and long-term thinking. The climate scenario also reveals your inability to think clearly about moral obligations across time. Your brain treats future people as less real and less morally significant than present people, even though future people will be just as capable of suffering as current people. This temporal discounting makes you systematically undervalue the welfare of future generations. But there's an even deeper problem. Your moral intuitions assume that harm caused by action is worse than harm caused by inaction. Not implementing the carbon tax feels like allowing natural consequences, while implementing it feels like actively hurting people. But this distinction is morally arbitrary. Both choices cause harm to different groups of people. Your brain also struggles with the collective nature of climate change. No single person's carbon emissions cause climate change, but everyone's emissions together do. This diffusion of responsibility makes it feel like individual actions don't matter, even though collective individual actions are the entire problem. American individualism makes this particularly confusing. You're taught that individuals are responsible for their own choices and outcomes, but climate change is fundamentally a collective action problem that can't be solved through individual responsibility alone. No amount of personal virtue can solve a systemic problem that requires coordinated policy changes. The scenario also reveals your confusion about different types of justice. Procedural justice focuses on fair processes, everyone following the same rules and bearing the same burdens. Distributive justice focuses on fair outcomes, ensuring that burdens and benefits are allocated appropriately. Climate policy requires thinking about both simultaneously. A carbon tax might seem procedurally unfair because it affects low-income people more than high-income people, but climate change is distributively unfair because it affects poor countries more than rich countries, and future generations more than current generations. Your brain can't easily balance these competing claims. Here's what makes this scenario particularly American. Your cultural emphasis on economic freedom and skepticism of government intervention makes you want to solve climate change through individual choices and market mechanisms rather than regulatory policies, but individual solutions are inadequate for collective problems of this scale. The carbon tax scenario forces you to choose between competing moral frameworks: care for specific, identifiable people versus care for statistical, anonymous people. responsibility to current generations versus responsibility to future generations, economic freedom versus environmental protection, local interests versus global interests. Your moral intuitions can't resolve these conflicts because they weren't designed to handle problems that span generations, cross national boundaries, and require statistical thinking about large populations. Climate change is exactly the kind of challenge that human moral reasoning is worst at addressing. This doesn't mean there's no right answer to the carbon tax question. It means that finding the right answer requires overriding your moral intuitions rather than following them. It requires thinking systematically about outcomes rather than emotionally about specific cases. It requires accepting that sometimes the ethical choice feels wrong at an intuitive level. Now let's explore a criminal justice scenario that will reveal how your beliefs about free will, personal responsibility, and punishment systematically distort your ethical judgment about crime and rehabilitation. This will challenge core American values about individual accountability and justice. You're a judge sentencing two defendants convicted of similar violent crimes. The first defendant grew up in a stable, middle-class family, received a good education, and had every opportunity to succeed. He committed the crime impulsively during a moment of anger and shows genuine remorse. The second defendant grew up in extreme poverty with an abusive, drug-addicted parent. He was malnourished as a child, suffered repeated head injuries, received minimal education, and was exposed to violence and criminality from an early age. Brain scans show abnormalities in regions associated with impulse control and moral reasoning. He shows little remorse and has a history of antisocial behavior. Traditional justice suggests the first defendant deserves a lighter sentence because he had fewer risk factors and shows more remorse. But neuroscience suggests the second defendant has less control over his behavior due to biological and environmental factors beyond his choice. How do you sentence these defendants? Do you focus on moral desert, punishment based on how bad the person is, or social utility, sentences based on what outcomes they produce? If you're like most people, you want to give the first defendant a lighter sentence because he seems more morally culpable and more likely to rehabilitate. But this intuition is based on assumptions about free will and personal responsibility that neuroscience increasingly challenges. The uncomfortable truth is that both defendants' actions were the result of factors largely beyond their control: genetics, brain chemistry, childhood experiences, social environment, and immediate circumstances. The first defendant isn't morally superior. He was luckier in the factors that shaped his brain and behavior. Your sense of moral desert assumes that people freely choose their actions and deserve consequences based on those choices. But neuroscience shows that criminal behavior emerges from the interaction of genetic predispositions, brain abnormalities, and environmental factors that no one chooses. This doesn't mean criminals aren't responsible for their actions. It means responsibility is more complex than your intuitions suggest. The brain damage that reduces impulse control also reduces moral culpability. The childhood trauma that increases violence also decreases the fairness of punishment. American culture makes this particularly difficult to accept because of its deep commitment to individual responsibility and just deserts. We want to believe that people choose their actions and deserve consequences proportional to their moral culpability. The idea that criminal behavior is largely determined by factors beyond individual control threatens core cultural values. But here's where your moral reasoning gets especially confused. You simultaneously believe that people are responsible for their crimes, but not responsible for the factors that caused them to commit crimes. You hold them accountable for actions that flow from circumstances they didn't create or choose. The scenario also reveals your inconsistent thinking about rehabilitation versus punishment. When dealing with the good criminal, you focus on rehabilitation because you believe he can change. When dealing with the bad criminal, you focus on punishment because you believe he deserves it. But this backwards, the worst criminal needs more rehabilitation, not more punishment. Your brain wants to use the criminal justice system to express moral outrage rather than to achieve useful outcomes. Punishing people who deserve it feels satisfying even if it doesn't reduce crime, help victims, or benefit society. This emotional satisfaction drives policy decisions that increase suffering without improving safety. The neuroscience of criminal behavior also challenges your assumptions about deterrence. If criminal behavior is largely driven by factors beyond conscious control, impulsivity, brain abnormalities, addiction, desperation, then harsh punishments are unlikely to prevent it. You can't deter behavior that isn't really chosen. This has enormous implications for American criminal justice policy. The emphasis on harsh sentences, three-strikes laws, and mass incarceration is based on the assumption that people rationally weigh costs and benefits before committing crimes. But most crime is committed by people whose decision-making is compromised by exactly the factors that make them likely to commit crimes. Here's what makes this scenario particularly disturbing. Your desire for retributive justice actually prevents the kind of interventions that would reduce crime. Money spent on prisons could be spent on education, mental health treatment, addiction programs, and poverty reduction, interventions that address the root causes of criminal behavior. But these preventive approaches don't satisfy your psychological need for moral desert. They help people before they commit crimes rather than punishing them afterward. They treat criminals as damaged people who need help rather than evil people who deserve suffering. The criminal justice scenario forces you to choose between emotionally satisfying but ineffective policies and emotionally unsatisfying but effective policies. It requires accepting that the people who most deserve punishment are often the people who most need help. Your moral intuitions want you to punish the worst criminals most harshly, but utilitarian reasoning suggests you should help the worst criminals most intensively. This contradiction reveals the fundamental inadequacy of retributive justice in a world where neuroscience shows that criminal behavior is largely determined by factors beyond individual control. The hardest part of this scenario isn't the legal complexity, it's accepting that moral desert might be an incoherent concept when applied to beings whose behavior is shaped by factors they didn't choose. It's recognizing that your desire for justice might be preventing you from creating a more just world. Let's examine an immigration scenario that will expose how your tribal instincts and in-group bias systematically distort your ethical judgment about borders, citizenship, and global justice. This will directly challenge American exceptionalism and nationalist assumptions about moral obligations. You're setting immigration policy for the United States. There are far more people who want to immigrate than can be practically accommodated. You must choose between prioritizing highly skilled immigrants who would contribute economically, refugees fleeing violence and persecution, family members of current citizens, or people from the poorest countries who would benefit most from migration opportunities. Each choice can be morally justified. Prioritizing skilled immigrants maximizes economic benefits for current citizens. Prioritizing refugees addresses urgent humanitarian needs. Prioritizing families respects existing social bonds. Prioritizing the global poor maximizes utility by helping those who need it most. But your moral intuitions strongly favor fellow citizens over foreigners, skilled immigrants over unskilled ones, and people who share your cultural background over those who don't. These preferences feel natural and justified, but they're actually expressions of tribal bias that have no moral foundation. The uncomfortable truth is that your birthplace is entirely random from a moral perspective. You didn't choose to be born American, and someone born in Guatemala didn't choose to be born Guatemalan. The accident of birth location shouldn't determine access to opportunities, life chances, or basic rights. But your brain treats national boundaries as morally significant because it evolved in small tribes where group membership was crucial for survival. You instinctively care more about people who share your identity markers, language, culture, nationality, even though these markers are arbitrary from an ethical standpoint. American culture makes this bias particularly strong through the mythology of exceptionalism and earned privilege. We tell ourselves that America's wealth and opportunities are the result of superior values, harder work, and better institutions, rather than geographical advantages, natural resources, and historical circumstances. This mythology allows you to feel that Americans deserve better treatment than non-Americans, that restricting immigration protects earned benefits rather than arbitrary privileges. But most differences in life outcomes between countries result from factors beyond individual control: geography, natural resources, historical timing, and institutional development. The immigration scenario also reveals your inability to think clearly about statistical versus identified lives. You're moved by stories of specific immigrants, the valedictorian facing deportation, the refugee family fleeing violence, but unmoved by statistics about global poverty and its effects on billions of people. Your empathy system activates for people you can see and identify with, but it doesn't scale to handle the massive suffering caused by global inequality. You focus on immigration's effects on identifiable Americans while ignoring its effects on anonymous foreigners who remain in poverty. But here's the deeper problem. Your moral framework assumes that nations have the right to exclude people from opportunities based on birthplace, but this assumption has no ethical foundation. National sovereignty is a political convenience, not a moral principle. Imagine if states had the same power to exclude people that nations do. Would it be ethical for California to prevent poor Americans from moving there for better opportunities? Would it be justified for rich neighborhoods to exclude people based on their place of birth? The moral arbitrary of such restrictions becomes obvious when applied domestically. Your brain treats international borders as morally significant because they align with your tribal instincts, but they're just lines drawn by historical accidents of war, geography, and political power. The fact that these lines now determine access to education, healthcare, economic opportunity, and basic safety is a massive moral injustice. The scenario also forces you to confront the tension between local and global ethics. You feel strong obligations to fellow Americans but weak obligations to foreigners, even though foreigners are capable of suffering just as much as Americans. This emotional parochialism leads to policies that prioritize minor benefits for Americans over major benefits for non-Americans. American immigration policy reflects this bias perfectly. We spend enormous resources preventing immigration while spending minimal resources addressing global poverty. We focus on protecting American workers from wage competition while ignoring the massive benefits that migration. We focus on protecting American workers from wage competition while ignoring the massive benefits that migration would provide to much poorer foreign workers. A small decrease in American wages could fund enormous improvements in living standards for people in developing countries. Your moral intuitions also struggle with the scale and complexity of global migration. Over 1 billion people live in extreme poverty and would dramatically improve their lives by moving to developed countries. But your brain can't process suffering at this scale. It treats 1 billion people in poverty as a statistic rather than a moral emergency. This inability to think at scale leads to policies that focus on symbolic rather than substantive concerns. You worry about cultural changes from immigration while ignoring the life and death stakes for potential migrants. You focus on maintaining familiar social environments while people die from preventable diseases in other countries. The immigration scenario reveals how your tribal psychology creates systematic blindness to the interests of outsiders. You instinctively weight the preferences of in-group members much more heavily than the vital needs of out-group members. This isn't evil, it's human, but it leads to moral conclusions that are impossible to justify from an impartial perspective. Here's what makes this particularly American. Our national mythology emphasizes freedom, equality, and opportunity as universal values, while simultaneously denying these same values to people based on arbitrary birthplace distinctions. We celebrate our immigrant heritage while restricting current immigration. We praise diversity while fearing demographic change. The scenario also exposes your confusion about earned versus inherited advantages. Americans often frame immigration restrictions as protecting what they've earned through hard work and good choices. But most American advantages, political stability, rule of law, educational systems, infrastructure, were inherited from previous generations rather than personally created. You didn't build the roads, schools, hospitals, and legal institutions that create American opportunities. You inherited them by accident of birth. Using them to justify excluding others is like inheriting a fortune and claiming you deserve it more than people who inherited poverty. The uncomfortable truth is that truly ethical immigration policy would prioritize the global poor over all other considerations. A person moving from extreme poverty to basic stability experiences massive improvements in well-being, while a wealthy society accommodating more immigrants experiences minor costs and inconveniences. But this conclusion feels absurd to your tribal instincts. It violates deep assumptions about group loyalty, national sovereignty, and earned privilege. It requires caring as much about strangers as neighbors, which your brain isn't designed to do. The immigration scenario forces you to choose between parochial loyalty and universal ethics, between tribal instincts and rational compassion, between protecting inherited advantages and extending opportunities to those who need them most. Your moral intuitions will consistently lead you toward the tribal choices, but ethical reasoning points toward the universal ones. Now let's examine a biotechnology scenario that will reveal how your status quo bias and technological conservatism systematically prevent you from supporting interventions that could eliminate enormous suffering. This will challenge American cultural assumptions about naturalness, risk, and the ethics of human enhancement. Scientists have developed a genetic therapy that could eliminate a hereditary disease affecting millions of people worldwide. The therapy would modify embryos to prevent the disease from developing, ensuring that treated individuals and all their descendants would be free from this source of suffering forever. The therapy is safe and effective, but it involves permanent genetic changes that will be passed to future generations. Critics argue that modifying human genetics is playing God, that it could have unforeseen consequences, and that it represents an unacceptable interference with natural processes. Supporters argue that allowing preventable suffering to continue when you have the power to stop it is morally equivalent to causing that suffering. They point out that we already interfere with nature through medicine, agriculture, and technology in countless ways that improve human welfare. Do you support the genetic therapy? If you're hesitant about genetic modification, you're experiencing what psychologists call the status quo bias, the tendency to prefer current states of affairs over changes, even when the changes would be beneficial. This bias makes you overweight the risks of action while underweighting the risks of inaction. Your brain treats the suffering caused by genetic diseases as natural and therefore acceptable, while treating the potential risks of genetic therapy as artificial and therefore concerning. But this distinction is morally arbitrary. Suffering is suffering regardless of whether it's caused by natural processes or human interventions. The playing God objection reveals another cognitive bias, the appeal to nature fallacy. You assume that natural processes are inherently good or right, even though nature produces enormous amounts of suffering through disease, disability, natural disasters, and death. There's nothing morally sacred about the status quo just because it's natural. American culture makes this bias particularly strong through cultural narratives about technological hubris and unintended consequences. Hollywood movies consistently portray genetic modification as leading to catastrophic outcomes, creating emotional associations between biotechnology and disaster that have no basis in scientific evidence. But here's what your risk assessment is missing. Genetic diseases cause massive certain suffering right now, while genetic therapy poses speculative, uncertain risks in the future. Your brain weights these asymmetrically, treating known suffering as acceptable and unknown risks as unacceptable. This is exactly backwards from a rational risk assessment. The burden of proof should be on those who want to continue allowing preventable suffering, not on those who want to prevent it. Doing nothing is a choice that causes harm just as much as doing something that might cause harm. The genetic therapy scenario also reveals your temporal bias in moral reasoning. You're more concerned about potential risks to future generations than about actual suffering by current generations. But future people aren't more morally significant than present people. If anything, we should weight present suffering more heavily because it's certain while future suffering is speculative. Your brain also struggles with the scale of genetic interventions. Treating one person with genetic therapy affects only that person, but modifying germline genetics affects all their descendants. This feels much more significant morally, even though it's actually much more beneficial, preventing suffering in thousands of future people rather than just one current person. The scenario forces you to confront your assumptions about human enhancement and the goals of medicine. Traditional medicine treats diseases after they develop, but genetic therapy prevents diseases from developing in the first place. This seems like an obvious improvement, but it violates your sense of what medicine should do. American cultural individualism creates additional problems for thinking about genetic modifications. You focus on individual autonomy and choice, but genetic modifications affect people who can't consent, future generations who inherit the modifications. Your framework for thinking about individual rights breaks down when applied to inheritable changes, but the deepest issue is your confusion about the goals of human existence. Do we have obligations to reduce suffering, increase capabilities, and improve well-being? Or should we accept whatever natural processes produce, even when they cause enormous pain and limitation? Your moral intuitions evolved when humans had no power to modify fundamental biological processes. They contain no guidance for situations where you can eliminate genetic diseases, enhance cognitive abilities, or extend healthy lifespans. This creates what philosophers call the enhancement dilemma. Our ethical frameworks lag behind our technological capabilities. The genetic therapy scenario also reveals class and access issues that complicate the moral calculation. If genetic modifications are expensive, they could increase inequality by giving advantages to children of wealthy parents. This concern about distributive justice can make you oppose beneficial technologies rather than demanding equitable access to them. But rejecting genetic therapy because of access concerns is like rejecting vaccines or antibiotics, because not everyone can afford them. The solution to unequal access isn't to prevent anyone from benefiting, it's to ensure everyone can benefit. Opposing beneficial technologies because they might increase inequality actually guarantees continued suffering for everyone. Here's what makes this scenario particularly challenging for American values. It requires taking collective responsibility for future generations in ways that transcend individual choice and market mechanisms. Genetic modifications affect entire populations over multiple generations, requiring coordinated policy responses rather than individual decisions. The genetic therapy scenario forces you to choose between conservative caution that preserves suffering and progressive intervention that risks unintended consequences. Your moral intuitions will push you toward caution because they treat the status quo as the baseline and changes as risks, but ethical reasoning suggests that preventing suffering should be the baseline and allowing suffering should require justification. For our final scenario, let's examine a situation that combines all the previous biases and reveals the ultimate limitation of human moral reasoning. A global coordination problem that requires sacrificing tribal loyalties for universal welfare. This will expose whether you're capable of genuine ethical thinking or forever trapped by evolved psychological limitations. An alien civilization contacts Earth with an offer. They will provide technology that eliminates poverty, disease, and aging for all humans, but only if humanity demonstrates its moral maturity by redistributing all wealth equally among every person on the planet within 1 year. No individual or nation would be allowed to keep more resources than any other individual or nation. The aliens explain that they've observed thousands of civilizations, and only those capable of overcoming tribal selfishness to achieve true global cooperation survive long enough to join the galactic community. Species that remain divided by artificial group boundaries inevitably destroy themselves through conflict over resources. The technology would create unprecedented prosperity for everyone. The poorest person, after redistribution, would be wealthier than today's middle class, and humanity would gain access to scientific knowledge that would revolutionize existence. But the process would require wealthy individuals and nations to give up their current advantages for the greater good. Do you support the global redistribution plan? This scenario combines every bias we've explored: status quo preference, in-group loyalty, loss aversion, moral parochialism, and the confusion between procedural and distributive fairness. It forces you to choose between tribal selfishness and universal welfare, between current advantages and future possibilities, between human psychological limitations and ethical reasoning. If you're like most people, you immediately start looking for reasons why the plan wouldn't work, why it's unfair to wealthy people, why your nation or group deserves to keep its current advantages. These aren't rational objections, they're psychological defenses against an outcome that threatens your tribal identity. The scenario reveals the ultimate limitation of human moral reasoning. You're capable of universal ethical thinking in abstract terms, but when faced with concrete choices that require personal or group sacrifice for universal benefit, your tribal psychology overrides your rational ethics. American culture makes this particularly difficult because of its emphasis on earned advantages and individual rights. The idea that Americans should give up their inherited advantages to help strangers in other countries violates deep cultural assumptions about merit, sovereignty, and justice. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Most global inequality results from factors beyond individual control: geographical advantages, historical timing, institutional development, and cultural inheritance. The fact that you were born in a wealthy country rather than a poor one is morally arbitrary, just like your genetic endowments or family background. From an impartial perspective, there's no moral justification for allowing accident of birth to determine life chances. If you're truly committed to fairness and equal opportunity, you should support redistribution that gives everyone the same starting point, regardless of birthplace. But your brain can't think impartially about situations that affect your own welfare. Even if you intellectually understand that global redistribution would be ethically justified, you emotionally resist it because it threatens your current position. You want justice in the abstract but oppose it in practice when it costs you personally. The alien scenario also reveals how your moral reasoning changes when personal stakes are involved. When judging other people's actions, you easily apply universal moral principles. When judging your own actions, you suddenly discover compelling reasons why universal principles don't apply to your specific situation. This isn't hypocrisy. It's the natural operation of psychological systems designed to protect self-interest while maintaining social reputation. Your brain convinces you that your self-serving judgments are actually principled positions because conscious awareness of your bias would be psychologically uncomfortable. The scenario forces you to confront the possibility that genuine morality might require overriding human nature rather than following it. Maybe being truly ethical means acting against your evolved psychological tendencies rather than trusting your moral intuitions. Throughout these 10 scenarios, you've seen how your moral reasoning systematically fails when confronted with complex trade-offs, statistical thinking, unfamiliar situations, and conflicts between personal and universal interests. Your ethical intuitions aren't reliable guides to right action. They're evolved psychological mechanisms that served specific functions in ancestral environments. This doesn't mean morality is impossible or that all ethical positions are equally valid. It means that genuine moral reasoning requires recognizing the limitations of intuitive judgment and developing tools for thinking more systematically about complex ethical problems. The scenarios we've explored share common themes: the inadequacy of individual-focused ethics for systemic problems, the importance of consequences over intentions, the moral arbitrariness of many inequalities we take for granted, and the systematic biases that distort human moral judgment. Here's the ultimate lesson: being a good person isn't about having good intentions or following your moral instincts. It's about recognizing that your moral instincts are often wrong and developing the intellectual humility to question your ethical certainties. Real moral progress requires accepting that your evolved psychology is inadequate for modern ethical challenges. It requires thinking statistically about suffering rather than focusing on identifiable victims. It requires considering long-term consequences rather than immediate effects. It requires caring about strangers as much as neighbors, future generations as much as current ones. Most importantly, it requires recognizing that the purpose of ethics isn't to make you feel good about yourself. It's to reduce suffering and increase well-being for all conscious creatures. Sometimes achieving this goal requires actions that feel wrong to your moral intuitions. Sometimes being truly ethical means accepting that you might be a worse person than you thought, but the world might be a better place than you feared. The court has rendered its verdict. Your moral intuitions are guilty of systematic bias, but you're capable of better judgment if you're willing to question everything you thought you knew about right and wrong.